My name is Sarah Hayes. At 33, I've built a life in Seattle that would surprise anyone who knew me growing up, especially my parents. I wasn't always the confident CEO staring back at you from tech magazine covers. For most of my life, I existed in the shadow of my sister Emily's achievements, watching as my parents showered her with praise while barely acknowledging my existence except to criticize. But life has a funny way of coming full circle. On March 15th, 2023, at precisely 7:42 p.m., I stood in the glass-walled boardroom of Hayes & Company Logistics headquarters in Phoenix, watching the blood drain from my father's face. My mother's perfectly manicured hand trembled as she reached for her water glass. The board members shifted uncomfortably in their leather chairs, eyes darting between me and my parents, Linda and Robert Hayes, the seemingly untouchable co-CEOs who had built this shipping empire from nothing. They thought I'd wired $5 million as a desperate attempt to earn their approval, a lifeline to rescue their sinking company. What they didn't know was that this transaction was merely the opening move in a carefully orchestrated endgame I'd been planning for years. "Sarah," my father began, his voice uncharacteristically soft. I want to thank you for your generous contribution. This investment will—" I raised my hand, cutting him off mid-sentence. "It's not a contribution, Dad. It's a takeover." The silence that followed was worth every tear I'd ever shed. Growing up in our sprawling Phoenix estate, I learned early that approval was conditional and love was something to be earned through achievement. Emily, 2 years younger than me but miles ahead in our parents' estimation, had been groomed from childhood to take over Hayes & Company someday. She had my father's business acumen and my mother's ruthless determination. I had, well, according to them, not much at all. "Sarah's the sensitive one," my mother would tell guests at their lavish dinner parties, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. "Emily's our businesswoman." What began as gentle comparison evolved into something far more damaging as we grew older. Every achievement of mine was measured against Emily's and inevitably found wanting. My full scholarship to Stanford? Cute, but nothing compared to Emily's early admission to Wharton. My first job at a respected marketing analytics firm? Why waste time working for someone else when Emily was already being groomed for executive leadership at Hayes & Company? I still remember July 10th, 2015. With painful clarity, my parents had invited potential investors to our home, and I'd flown in from Seattle specially for the occasion, fresh from a promotion. I'd been excited to share my news. Maybe this time they'd see my value. "Sarah's working in marketing," my mother explained to a distinguished-looking couple, her tone suggesting she was describing a hobby rather than a career. "Actually," I interjected with a smile, "I've just been promoted to lead analyst. Our team developed a predictive model that increased client conversions by 43% last quarter." The couple looked genuinely impressed, but before they could respond, my mother laughed, that tinkling, dismissive sound I'd grown to hate. "Numbers and charts," she said, waving her hand. "Emily just secured the West Ridge contract, $30 million in new business. That's real achievement." Later that evening, when I confronted her privately about her dismissal of my accomplishments, she looked at me with genuine confusion. "Don't be so sensitive, Sarah. You'll never amount to anything in this industry if you can't handle a little criticism." My father, overhearing, simply added, "Your sister was managing accounts triple the size of your entire company at your age. Stop comparing yourself. It's embarrassing." Their words burned, but I swallowed the pain as I always had. I'd hoped that as an adult, I could earn their respect. I was beginning to realize that might never happen. The pattern continued. In September 2017, I learned that the $50,000 my grandmother had set aside specifically for my education had been reallocated to fund Emily's business trip to Shanghai. When I questioned the decision, my parents seemed genuinely perplexed by my objection. "Emily's trip will secure the Asian market for Hayes & Company," my father explained as if talking to a child. "That benefits the entire family. Your grandmother would have understood the bigger picture." By January 2019, I'd begun developing the concept for what would eventually become Blue Peak Analytics, excited about the potential. I called my father to share my business plan. A data analytics startup? He sighed heavily into the phone. Sarah, those are a dime a dozen. Silicon Valley is littered with the corpses of failed tech startups. But Dad, my approach is different. I've identified a gap in predictive supply chain analytics that nobody cares about your startup idea. Sarah, he interrupted, you're too sensitive about criticism. Always have been. This is why Emily's succeeding while you're still chasing pipe dreams. Each interaction chipped away at my self-confidence, but something within me refused to be extinguished. Perhaps it was spite, perhaps self-preservation, but I began keeping my professional life entirely separate from my family. I stopped sharing my accomplishments, my struggles, my growth. If they couldn't see my value, I wouldn't waste energy trying to convince them. Then came the night that changed everything. December 18th, 2019. The annual Hayes Income Holiday Gala at the Willowbrook Estate in Denver. I'd almost declined the invitation, but some masochistic part of me still craved my parents' approval. So I flew in from Seattle, donned an expensive dress I couldn't really afford, and prepared myself for an evening of subtle and not-so-subtle reminders of my inadequacy. The ballroom glittered with crystal chandeliers and the wealthy elite of the logistics industry. My sister Emily worked the room like she was born to it, her laughter carrying across the space as she charmed investors and partners alike. My parents beamed with pride watching her, occasionally touching her arm or shoulder in unconscious gestures of approval. I stood alone by the bar, nursing a glass of champagne, when my father clinked his glass for attention. The room quieted as he began his annual address, thanking key players and announcing the company's successes. I half listened, having heard variations of this speech for years. And finally, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed room, I'd like to address something that's been the subject of speculation, the future leadership of Hayes & Co. My heart stuttered. I knew Emily was being groomed to take over eventually, but they'd never made an official announcement. Many of you have asked if my eldest daughter, Sarah, might be joining the executive team alongside Emily. My champagne glass froze halfway to my lips. They were discussing me? My father's gaze found mine across the room, and for a fleeting moment, I saw something like regret in his eyes. Then it vanished, replaced by the cool assessment I knew so well. I want to put those rumors to rest. Sarah has chosen to pursue her pet projects away from the family business, while we support her hobby. The future of Hayes & Co. rests securely with Emily and our executive team. Nervous laughter rippled through the crowd. My cousin Mark, standing nearby, shot me a sympathetic glance. The family lawyer looked away, embarrassed. To Emily, my father continued, raising his glass, the true Hayes successor and the future of our legacy. The room erupted in applause. My mother beamed. Emily accepted the toast with practiced humility, and I stood perfectly still, champagne forgotten, as something inside me finally, irrevocably broke. I don't remember leaving the gala. I came to awareness sitting in my rented Chevy Bolt in the parking lot, hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly, my knuckles shone white in the darkness. Tears streamed down my face, but they weren't tears of sadness or humiliation. They were tears of rage, pure, clarifying anger that burned away decades of self-doubt. My father found me there an hour later as guests were beginning to leave. He tapped on the window, and I lowered it, not bothering to wipe my face. "You're making a scene, Sarah," he said quietly. "People are asking where you went." "Why would they care? I'm just pursuing my hobbies, right?" He sighed, rubbing his forehead. "It was a joke, Sarah. You're too sensitive." My analytics work saved digital marketing campaigns for Fortune 500 companies last year, I said, my voice steady despite the tears. "Why can't you see my value, Dad? Why is nothing I do ever good enough?" Something flickered in his eyes. Perhaps recognition, perhaps regret, but it was quickly replaced by the dismissive expression I knew so well. This isn't the place for one of your emotional displays. We'll talk later when you're being rational." He turned and walked away, back to the gala, back to Emily, back to the company that would always value spreadsheets over people. I watched him go, and in that moment, I made a decision that would alter all our lives. I would build something they couldn't ignore, something so successful, so undeniably valuable, that they would be forced to acknowledge my worth. And when they did, when they finally saw me, I would use that recognition to destroy everything they'd built. That night in the Willowbrook Estate parking lot, the plan for my revenge was born. I returned to Seattle with renewed purpose. The concept I'd been developing for Blue Peak Analytics suddenly gained crystal clarity. I would focus on predictive analytics for supply chain optimization, the very heart of logistics companies like Hayes & Koto. I would build a solution so revolutionary that my parents' company would eventually need it to survive. For the next 6 months, I worked 18-hour days, refining my algorithms, building my prototype, and preparing my pitch deck. I cashed out my 401k, sold my condo, and moved into a tiny studio apartment to extend my runway. When I wasn't coding or developing business models, I was networking, connecting with potential investors and industry experts who might see what my parents couldn't. In July 2020, Blue Peak Analytics officially launched with a seed round of $2 million, led by Vertex Ventures, a firm known for backing disruptive technologies. Our platform offered something revolutionary: real-time predictive analytics for supply chain optimization that could identify inefficiencies and potential breakdowns before they occurred. In an industry where delays cost millions, our solution was gold. I hired strategically, building a team of brilliant misfits who, like me, had something to prove. We worked out of a converted warehouse in Seattle's industrial district, our office walls covered with whiteboards filled with code and algorithms. I drove them hard, but no harder than I drove myself. This wasn't just a company, it was my vindication. By December 2021, Blue Peak had secured Series A funding of $8 million. Our client list included 3 Fortune 500 companies, none of them direct competitors to Hayes & Koto's. I was saving that particular conquest for later. My personal net worth, mostly tied up in company equity, had reached $7 million. I bought back my condo and purchased the one next door, combining them into a spacious home overlooking Elliott Bay. Throughout this period, I maintained minimal contact with my family. Holiday calls, obligatory birthday wishes. I deflected questions about my work with vague references to doing well in tech. My parents, predictably, didn't press for details. Emily occasionally texted, usually to share news of her latest achievement or to ask perfunctory questions about my life. I responded politely but revealed nothing. Meanwhile, I kept tabs on Hayes & Koto through industry publications and financial reports. The company was still successful, but signs of trouble were emerging. Their technology was becoming outdated. They'd missed the shift to cloud-based logistics management. Several key clients had jumped ship to competitors with more innovative solutions. In March 2022, I made my first strategic move. Using a shell company, I quietly became a silent stakeholder in 2 Seattle-based tech firms that provided services to Hayes & Koto. This gave me access to information about their operations that would prove invaluable. Through these connections, I learned that Hayes & Koto was hemorrhaging money on outdated systems and inefficient processes, exactly the problems Blue Peak had been designed to solve. By December 2022, my net worth had climbed to $12 million. Blue Peak was valued at $40 million, with a client retention rate of 96%. We'd expanded to 28 employees and moved to sleek offices in downtown Seattle. Industry publications were beginning to take notice. TechCrunch ran a profile calling me the dark horse of supply chain analytics. Wired mentioned Blue Peak as one of the top 10 startups to watch. And Hayes & Co. was in trouble. Their Q4 earnings showed a loss of $3.2 million, their first quarterly loss in 15 years. Their stock price had fallen 22% over the past year. Industry analysts were questioning their ability to compete in an increasingly digital landscape. It was time for the next phase of my plan. I began by gathering evidence, financial statements, board meeting minutes, records of my parents' treatment of me over the years. I set up a consultation with Whitfield Legal Group, one of Seattle's top corporate law firms, on January 5, 2023. I laid out my situation to Patricia Whitfield herself, a shark in designer clothing who specialized in hostile takeovers. "So let me get this straight," she said after I'd explained everything. "You want to offer a bailout to your parents' company, use it as leverage for a board seat, and then execute a hostile takeover?" "Yes." "And this is because they were mean to you at Christmas parties?" Her eyebrow arched skeptically. I slid a folder across her desk. "This is a partial record of the psychological abuse I experienced for 20 years. This isn't about hurt feelings, Ms. Whitfield. This is about justice." She flipped through the documents, her expression shifting from skepticism to something like respect. "Well," she said finally, closing the folder, "revenge isn't usually a sound business strategy, but in this case," she smiled thinly, "Hayes & Cote actually is undervalued and mismanaged. There's a solid business case here alongside your personal vendetta. We can work with that." Together, we crafted a strategy timed to coincide with Hayes & Co. Q1 earnings call on March 15th. By then, their financial situation would be even more precarious, making my offer of investment irresistible. What I didn't anticipate was finding an ally within Hayes & Co. itself. In February, I received an email from a woman named Jenna Wilson, my sister's executive assistant. The subject line read simply, "We should talk." Suspicious but intrigued, I agreed to a video call. Jenna was in her late 20s, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that seemed at odds with Emily's preference for sycophants. "I know who you are," she said without preamble. "The real you, not the version your family talks about." "And what version is that?" I asked carefully. "The failure, the disappointment, the sensitive one who couldn't cut it." She leaned closer to the camera. "I've done my research. Ms. Hayes, I know about Blue Peak. I know what you've built." My pulse quickened. "Does Emily know?" Jenna laughed, a short, harsh sound. "Emily barely knows what day it is unless it's on her calendar, and your parents are too busy trying to save their sinking ship to look beyond their immediate circle. Why are you contacting me?" Her expression hardened. "I've worked for your sister for 3 years. In that time, I've been belittled, gaslit, and treated like furniture. Your parents are worse. Robert Hayes made me reschedule my mother's cancer surgery because it conflicted with his golf game. Linda Hayes forgot to process my raise for 6 months, then suggested I should be grateful for the job." She paused, seeming to collect herself. "I'm leaving Hayes & Co. next month. Before I go, I thought you might be interested in these." She held up a flash drive. Q4 financials, board meeting minutes, internal projections, the real versions, not the sanitized ones they released to shareholders. "That's corporate espionage," I said quietly. "That's whistleblowing," she corrected. "The board hasn't been fully informed about the company's financial position. Your parents are misleading investors." I considered her for a long moment. "What do you want in exchange?" "A job," she said simply. "At Blue Peak. I'm very good at what I do, Ms. Hayes, and I'd rather work for someone who understands the value of people over profit margins." 2 days later, a package arrived at my condo containing the flash drive. The information it held was more damning than I could have hoped. Hayes & Company wasn't just struggling. It was on the verge of collapse. They needed at least $5 million to cover upcoming payroll and operational costs. Without it, they'd have to start laying off employees or selling assets at a loss. The final piece of my plan fell into place. I spent the next month preparing, working closely with Patricia Whitfield to ensure every detail was legally sound. I arranged for the $5 million to be ready for wire transfer. I prepared 2 sets of documents, one for the initial investment, another for the takeover that would follow. On March 14th, I flew to Phoenix. I checked into the Four Seasons, ordered room service, and tried to sleep. Tomorrow would change everything. The Hayes & Co. headquarters stood 15 stories tall in downtown Phoenix, a glass and steel monument to my parents' ambition. I'd visited many times growing up, always feeling like an intruder. Today, as I passed through the revolving doors into the marble-floored lobby, I felt something entirely different. Ownership. The receptionist didn't recognize me. Why would she? I gave my name and watched her eyes widen slightly as she made the connection. Ms. Hayes, we weren't expecting. Your parents didn't mention. It's a surprise, I said smoothly. I'm here for the board meeting. Of course. She fumbled for the phone. I'll let them know you're here. No need, I smiled. I remember the way. The executive elevator required a key card, which I didn't have. I took a quiet satisfaction in being escorted up by security, imagining the confused calls happening ahead of my arrival. The doors opened on the 15th floor, revealing the executive suite where all major decisions for Hayes & Company were made. My mother's assistant, a nervous man named Alan, was waiting for me. Ms. Hayes, he said, clearly flustered. This is unexpected. The board meeting is a closed session. I'm family, I replied, moving past him toward the boardroom. And I'm about to become their largest individual investor. I think they'll make an exception. I heard him hurrying after me, protesting weakly, but I was already pushing open the heavy wooden doors to the boardroom. 12 people sat around a massive table of polished walnut. My father at the head, my mother to his right, Emily to his left. The other 9 were board members, mostly older men, a few women, all wearing expressions of grave concern. A PowerPoint slide showing declining revenue projections was frozen on the wall screen. My entrance stopped all conversation. 12 heads turned simultaneously. 12 pairs of eyes widened in shock. Sarah? My father recovered first, half rising from his chair. What are you doing here? I stepped fully into the room, closing the door behind me. I wore a navy blue suit, the same style my mother had once told me I couldn't pull off with my body type. My hair was pulled back in a sleek ponytail. My makeup minimal but precise. I looked every inch the CEO I had become. Hello, Dad, Mom, Emily. I nodded to each in turn. Members of the board, I apologize for interrupting, but I believe you're discussing an issue I can help with. My mother's face had gone pale. This is a private meeting. Sarah, whatever you think you're doing. Financial insolvency, I interrupted, moving to the side of the room where a laptop connected to the projector. May I? Without waiting for permission, I inserted a flash drive and pulled up my own presentation. The screen changed to show a simple slide. Hayes & Company, Q4 losses, $3.2 million. A murmur ran through the board members. These are confidential figures, my father said, his voice dangerously low. Where did you get this information? I ignored him, advancing to the next slide. Hayes & Company, projected Q1 losses, $2.8 million. Sarah, Emily spoke for the first time, her voice tight with controlled panic. You need to leave, now. I advanced to the next slide. Blue Peak Analytics valuation, $40 million. Confusion replaced anger on several faces. My mother's expression froze. My father squinted at the screen as if he couldn't quite process what he was seeing. Blue Peak Analytics, I said into the silence, is my company. I founded it in 2020. We specialize in predictive analytics for supply chain optimization, exactly the technology Hayes & Co. has failed to develop or acquire. I advanced to the final slide. Sarah Hayes' personal assets, $12 million. The room was absolutely silent now. I could almost hear the mental calculations happening behind each pair of eyes. My mother's voice faltered. You did what? I built a successful tech company, I replied calmly. The kind of achievement you and Dad might recognize, if you'd ever bothered to see me as anything more than a disappointment. My father had gone from pale to flushed. I called you a failure. Many times, I agreed. It was quite motivating, actually. Emily leaned forward, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the table. "This is all very impressive, Sarah, but why are you here? Why now?" I closed my presentation and faced the board directly. Hayes & Company needs an immediate infusion of $5 million to meet operational costs and prevent layoffs. Without it, you'll default on your loans by the end of the quarter. I'm prepared to wire those funds today. Relief flooded several faces. My father's shoulders sagged slightly. "But," I continued, "my investment comes with conditions." Of course it did. No one at that table would expect anything less. Money never came without strings, especially in business. "I want a seat on the board," I said, "and I want a public acknowledgement of my contribution to saving this company." My father nodded slowly. These were reasonable demands, expected even. "We can arrange that. The board will need to vote. But under the circumstances—" "I'm not finished," I said quietly. "I also want a shareholder vote on new executive leadership." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "What exactly are you proposing?" asked Walter Chen, the longest-serving board member. I removed a document from my briefcase and slid it across the table. "A restructuring. The $5 million buys Tempet of Hayes & Conch, making me the third-largest shareholder, combined with proxies I've already secured from minority shareholders. I'll control approximately 28% of voting shares." My father snatched up the document, scanning it with increasingly frantic eyes. This is a hostile takeover proposal." "Yes," I agreed simply. "You can't do this," my mother hissed, her composure finally cracking. "We're your family. You made it very clear that business and family are separate. Mom, nothing personal, just business. Isn't that what you always said?" Emily was rapidly typing on her phone, probably messaging the company lawyers. "This won't stand up legally. You can't force a vote without evidence of mismanagement and fiduciary negligence." I produced another document. "Like the fact that you've been misrepresenting the company's financial position to shareholders for the past 3 quarters? Or that you diverted company funds to personal expenses totaling over $700,000 last year alone?" My father's face had gone from red to gray. "Where did you get this information?" "Does it matter? It's accurate, isn't it?" The board members were exchanging alarmed glances now. Walter Chen reached for the second document, which my father reluctantly released. "Is this true, Robert?" Chen asked, his voice heavy with disappointment. My father didn't answer, which was answer enough. "Here's what's going to happen," I said into the silence. "I will wire $5 million to Hayes & Co. today. The board will vote to accept my investment and board seat. In 2 weeks, we will hold a shareholder meeting to vote on new executive leadership. Until then, business continues as usual." "And if we refuse?" my mother asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "Then I walk away, and you explain to your employees, shareholders, and the SEC why Hayes & Co. is suddenly insolvent." I met her gaze steadily. "Your choice." For a long moment, no one spoke. I could see the calculations happening behind my father's eyes, looking for a way out, an angle he hadn't considered, a countermove, finding none. Finally, Walter Chen cleared his throat. "I move that we accept Ms. Hayes's investment offer and board seat, pending legal review of the terms." "Seconded," said Diane Reeves, another board member. "Those in favor?" Chen asked. 9 hands went up immediately. After a moment's hesitation, Emily raised hers as well, not looking at me. My parents sat motionless, defeated. "The motion carries," Chen announced. "Welcome to the board, Ms. Hayes." I nodded my acknowledgement, then took out my phone. With a few taps, I initiated the wire transfer that would seal the deal. $5 million has been transferred to the Hayes & Company primary account. You'll find the confirmation in your email. Mr. Chen. I gathered my things and stood to leave, pausing at the door to deliver a final message. For the record, I never wanted to be part of Hayes & Co. I built something better, something that actually values innovation and people. This isn't about joining your company. It's about reshaping it into something worthy of its employees' talents. I left them sitting there, stunned and silent, and walked out of the building that had for so long symbolized my inadequacy, in the lobby. I passed Jenna, who gave me a small nod of acknowledgement. Her last day at Hayes & Company, and her first act of reclaiming her dignity. Outside, the Phoenix sun was blinding. I put on my sunglasses and took a deep breath of desert air, feeling lighter than I had in years. Phase 1 was complete. Now came the hard part. The next 2 weeks were a blur of legal meetings, press inquiries, and strategic planning. News of my investment in Hayes & Company leaked almost immediately, sparking speculation about the future of the company. TechCrunch ran a headline on March 16th. Blue Peak founder invests $5 in family business, reconciliation or takeover. My parents attempted to fight back. Of course, my father threatened lawsuits, claimed I'd obtained confidential information illegally, even tried to paint me as mentally unstable in conversations with key shareholders. My mother took a different approach, calling me in tears, appealing to family loyalty, then switching to threats when that didn't work. I remained calm through it all, letting Patricia Whitfield handle the legal threats while I focused on building support among shareholders and employees. I gave exactly one interview to the Wall Street Journal, where I outlined my vision for modernizing Hayes & Company without mentioning family drama once. The contrast between my professional demeanor and my parents' increasingly desperate tactics did not go unnoticed. Emily surprised me by requesting a private meeting 3 days before the shareholder vote. We met at a neutral location, a quiet restaurant in Scottsdale, where she arrived looking uncharacteristically disheveled. "You could have warned me," she said without preamble as she slid into the booth across from me. "Would you have listened?" She didn't answer directly. "Do you hate me that much? That you'd destroy everything we've built?" "I don't hate you. Emily, I don't even blame you. You were as much a pawn in their game as I was. You just happened to be the favored one." She scoffed. "I earned my position." "Did you? Or were you simply given opportunities I never was? How many times did they introduce you to key clients, include you in strategic meetings, mentor you through challenges? How many times did they do that for me?" She looked away, uncomfortable with the question. "I'm not destroying Hayes & Co., I continued. "I'm saving it. The company has been mismanaged for years. It's fallen behind technologically. Employees are underpaid and undervalued. The culture is toxic. None of that is your fault. But you've been complicit." "So this is what? Some kind of intervention?" Her tone was sarcastic, but I caught the hint of uncertainty beneath it. "In a way," I conceded. "Hayes & Cody has potential. Good people work there. With proper leadership and technological investment, it could thrive again." She studied me for a long moment. And where do I fit in this brave new world? I'd anticipated this question. "That depends on you. You're smart, Emily. You know the industry. If you're willing to adapt, to learn, to work as part of a team rather than expecting deference, there's a place for you." "Under you," she said flatly. "Under qualified leadership," I corrected. "Which might include you, eventually, but you'd have to earn it, just like everyone else." She was quiet for a long time, absently turning her water glass in slow circles. Finally, she looked up. "They're going to lose, aren't they?" "Yes." She nodded slowly. "I won't stand with them at the shareholder meeting. I can't support you yet, but I won't oppose you either." It was more than I'd expected. "Thank you." As she gathered her purse to leave, she paused. "For what it's worth, I always thought they were wrong about you. I just didn't have the courage to say it." I watched her walk away, feeling a complicated mix of emotions I couldn't quite name. Perhaps, someday, there might be a relationship worth salvaging there, but that was a concern for another day. The shareholder meeting was held in the same boardroom where I'd made my initial move. This time, however, I arrived early and took a seat at the head of the table, a symbolic gesture that wasn't lost on anyone who entered. The room filled gradually, board members, major shareholders, company executives. My parents arrived last, walking in with the stiff dignity of people attending their own funeral. Emily slipped in separately, taking a seat away from them, her expression carefully neutral. Walter Chen called the meeting to order. The vote was the only item on the agenda. Each major shareholder would cast their vote verbally, followed by a tally of the proxy votes held by the board secretary. One by one, they voted. Some for my parents, more for me. The momentum was clear even before the final count was announced. With 62% of shares voting in favor, Chen announced, the motion to restructure executive leadership passes. Robert and Linda Hayes are removed as CEO and COO. Effective immediately, Sarah Hayes is appointed interim CEO, with a search committee to be formed for permanent executive positions. My father stood abruptly. This is a mistake. This company was built on relationships I've cultivated for 30 years. Without me, those relationships can be maintained by the talented team you've assembled, I interrupted smoothly. No company should be dependent on a single person. Dad, that's what you always taught me. His face flushed with anger, but my mother placed a restraining hand on his arm. Without another word, they walked out of the boardroom, leaving behind the company they'd built and the daughter they'd underestimated. The next few months were a whirlwind of change. I split my time between Seattle and Phoenix, leading both Blue Peak and Hayes & Company through a transition period. We rebranded Hayes & Company to H2 Logistics, symbolizing both the Hayes heritage and a second generation of leadership. We invested heavily in technology, implementing Blue Peak's analytics platform throughout the organization and retraining employees on new systems. Some executives left, unwilling to adapt to the new culture. Others thrived, finally free to innovate and contribute ideas, without fear of dismissal. Jenna Wilson became my chief of staff, proving herself to be as exceptional as she'd claimed. Emily, to my surprise, requested a lateral move to head business development, a role that suited her networking skills without putting her in direct competition with me. My parents retreated to their vacation home in Sedona, refusing all contact. I hadn't expected forgiveness, but their complete withdrawal still stung in moments of quiet reflection. Old wounds don't heal overnight, even when vengeance is achieved. The true test came 6 months later, when H2 Logistics released its first quarterly earnings under new leadership. Revenue was up 15%, operating costs were down 22%, employee satisfaction scores had risen from 62% to 84%. The stock price had nearly doubled. Financial media took notice. Bloomberg ran a feature titled, "The Hayes Heir Apparent: How Sarah Hayes Transformed Her Family's Legacy." Fortune included me in their 40 under 40 list. Harvard Business Review published a case study on the turnaround. In April 2024, exactly 1 year after the takeover, I received an unexpected email from my father. It contained no text, just a link to an Instagram video. Curious despite myself, I clicked. My parents appeared on screen, sitting stiffly in their Sedona living room. They looked older, somehow, though it had only been a year. "We want to publicly acknowledge," my father began, his voice formal, "that we were wrong about our daughter Sarah. The success of H2 Logistics under her leadership speaks for itself. We apologize for our failure to recognize her talents and for the hurtful things we said over the years." My mother nodded beside him, adding nothing. The video ended as awkwardly as it had begun. No request to reconnect, no suggestion of reconciliation, simply an acknowledgement of error and a public apology, the bare minimum I had demanded as part of the takeover agreement. It should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt hollow. The victory I'd worked so hard for, dreamed of for so long, tasted like ashes. What had I really won? A company I never wanted, an apology forced by legal obligation rather than genuine remorse, the knowledge that I'd hurt them as they'd hurt me. I closed my laptop and walked to the window of my Seattle office, below. The city stretched toward the sound, busy with people living lives untouched by my personal drama. For years, I'd defined myself by what I wasn't. Not good enough, not valued, not seen. Then I'd defined myself by my quest for vindication. Now, standing at the pinnacle of that quest, I realized I needed to define myself by what I wanted to build, not what I wanted to destroy. The next day, I announced my intention to step down as CEO of H2 Logistics once a suitable replacement was found. I would remain on the board, maintaining my ownership stake, but my focus would return to Blue Peak Analytics and its mission to revolutionize how companies understood their data. 3 months later, we appointed a new CEO, a brilliant woman from outside the industry who brought fresh perspective and none of the baggage of the Hayes family saga. I attended her first board meeting, then quietly excused myself from the day-to-day operations of H2 Logistics. Back in Seattle, I refocused on Blue Peak, expanding our services beyond supply chain analytics into healthcare and renewable energy. We grew to 60 employees, moved to larger offices, and secured Series B funding that valued the company at $90 million US. I found purpose in building something that existed not as a response to my parents' criticism, but as an expression of my own vision. Emily and I established a cautious professional relationship that occasionally verged on friendly. My parents remained distant, though they sent a formal congratulatory note when Blue Peak was featured in Forbes. Some wounds, perhaps, are too deep to fully heal. But healing, I've learned, doesn't always mean reconciliation. Sometimes it means moving forward, creating a life rich with people who value you for exactly who you are. I built a chosen family of friends, colleagues, and mentors who saw my worth without needing me to prove it constantly. H2 Logistics reported $18 million in Q2 2024 revenue, its best quarter in company history. The press release included a quote from me as board member, expressing pride in the company's transformation. What it didn't mention was that I no longer defined myself by that accomplishment. If there's a lesson in my story, it's not that revenge succeeds or fails. It's that your worth isn't defined by those who doubt you, or even by proving those doubts wrong. True vindication comes from building a life that makes their opinion irrelevant. I am Sarah Hayes. I built a multi-million-dollar company. I orchestrated a corporate takeover. I transformed my family's legacy. But more importantly, I am enough, exactly as I am, and I no longer need anyone else to confirm it.